Hey guys, so I'm going to be testing the massive new RTX 4080. I will be directly comparing it to the 3080. I want to see how much of an improvement they've made since they released the 3080 back in 2020. I'll be running benchmarks and stress tests, and I'll be recording scores and temps to see what kind of performance I get out of this bad boy. I need to stop going blah, blah, blah. Let's see what the difference is. Should be thick. So if you're comparing the size difference between the 3080 and the 4080, the difference is massive. It's a dual slot card versus a triple slot card. With a bigger fan and a bigger heatsink, it should be able to handle power more efficiently. There's also more video RAM, 16 gigs of RAM versus the 10 gigs of RAM. So let's go ahead and benchmark these bad boys. These are the specs for both the 4080 and the 3080, and you'll see that the 4080 has a much faster clock speed at 2.51 gigahertz versus 1.71 gigahertz. It also has more CUDA cores and has the same total graphics power, but should be more efficient according to Nvidia. First, I'm going to run the Furmark stress test. I'm going to compare the temps I get with both GPUs. After that, I'm going to run the Userbenchmark test. After that, I'll run a 3D benchmark test. It's going to be the Firestrike Extreme test. We'll compare scores there. After that, I'll run the Cyberpunk benchmark as well as the Shadow the Tomb Raider benchmark. Finally, we'll do some gaming. I'll compare the temps I get and I'll compare the FPS I get, and I'll see if I can see a difference between the cards. I am going to be running everything in 1440p. I'm going to do ultra settings on everything, and then if the game supports ray tracing, I'll do ray tracing as well. Let's get to it. Furmark test. I don't typically like to do this test because it puts a lot of stress on the components. Now, that's also a good test to see how these components do under stress. So it's good and bad. So I'm gonna run the stress test on the GPU and the CPU at the same time to generate the maximum amount of heat I can. I'll record the max temp for both, and hopefully nothing bad happens. Let's do it. So after running it for 10 minutes, the 4080 was at 65 degrees Celsius versus the 3080, which was at 71 degrees Celsius. Now the 13600K did heat up. It was at 86 degrees, which isn't a pretty number. You're probably wanting a triple fan radiator to keep those temps down. But yeah, that's the Furmark test. So this test is the Firestrike Extreme test. I like running this test because it does depend on your GPU and your CPU. We'll compare temps and we'll compare scores. Holy crap, my score is pretty high. It says my score is better than 99% of all the results. That's the highest I've ever seen it. So the 4080 gets 30,389 versus the 3080, 20,397. If we're just looking at the average temperature of the GPU, you're looking at 56 degrees on the 4080 and 69 on the 3080, which is interesting. You would think the 4080 would generate more heat. At least that's what I would think. I was surprised to see a jump in 10,000 points, as well as it not even getting as hot as the 3080. That was unexpected. You're getting the 66% increase in FPS, according to the first graphics test. So you're getting 181 frames per second versus 109 frames per second. Now the second graphics test, you got a little lower, 58% difference in FPS, 123 frames per second versus 77 frames per second. Pretty significant increase in FPS if you're gonna be upgrading to a 4080. The only thing is the 3080 was $700 and the 4080 is it 1100? No, it's $700 versus $1,200. So there's about a 71% increase in price. According to this test, you're not getting a 71% increase in performance. Yeah, when you just compare the scores, it's pretty impressive, but then when you compare the price, it's like, eh. But anyways, those are the scores. Next is a Userbenchmark test. I'm starting it right now. We'll compare 3080 versus 4080. For gaming, I got 412%, which is the highest score I've ever had, versus 260%. Desktop was even at 122%. Workstation was 452% versus 279%. And according to Userbenchmark, the 4080 is about 62% faster in effective speed, and the average score is about 68% better, which when I ran my Firestrike Extreme test, that was pretty accurate. I was getting about 68% better performance in at least one of the GPU tests. So now going to the Tomb Raider benchmark test, 4080 total frames rendered is 36,498 versus 33,037 on the 3080. The average FPS with the 4080 is 233 frames per second versus 211 on the 3080. That was an okay increase. Nothing crazy, nothing out of this world. So yeah, pretty anticlimactic, that's it. So I'm running the Cyberpunk benchmark test right now. I'm gonna run a benchmark with ray tracing on and with ray tracing off, and then we'll compare the FPS. I'll have you guys know my wife made me a sandwich. So first I'll tell you the ray tracing numbers. With the 4080, I averaged 92 frames per second. Total frames rendered was 5,903 versus the 3080. I got 60 frames per second average, 3,883 frames rendered. Now, if you're comparing the non-ray trace numbers, you get about 108 frames per second, 6,939 frames rendered versus 72 frames per second average, 4,631 frames rendered total. So when I was playing Cyberpunk with the 3080 with ray tracing on, I actually wasn't getting 60 frames per second. I was more in a 45 to 60 frame per second range. It was playable. I can definitely see a difference when I have ray tracing on. It just looks more realistic. I haven't played with it with the 4080 yet, but according to the benchmark test, you should be getting about 91 frames per second. It should look smoother. And then if you turn ray tracing off, you'll get 108, which is closer to what you want. Because it's a 144 hertz monitor, you want to be closer to 144 frames per second. This was ultra everything. You may need to turn down some of the settings to get 144 frames per second. That's a Cyberpunk test. I'm gonna do at least 30 minutes of gaming. Probably gonna play Cyberpunk and GTA, just cause. So let's go ahead and do it.
Fucking drive, Jackie.
While I was gaming, the max temp I saw on the 4080 was 60 degrees Celsius and the CPU was 63 degrees. With Cyberpunk, I was getting between 75 and 90 frames per second. With GTA, I was at 144 frames per second. It is an older game, so I would expect it to be getting at least 144 frames per second. Now, going to the 3080, I got 73 degrees is my max temp on the GPU, 67 degrees on the CPU, 144 on GTA, and 60 to 40 frames with Cyberpunk. The 4080 was actually not as hot as the 3080. If you're running more frames per second at ultra settings, obviously the 4080 would be the better way to go. So with Cyberpunk, there's about a 30 frame per second difference between the 4080 and the 3080 at ultra settings with ray tracing on. GTA 5, zero difference. It's an older game. The only difference was that the 4080 ran cooler than the 3080. Well, now that I've compared a 4080 and a 3080, what do I think? I think when it comes to newer games like Cyberpunk, I say newer because I still like to play GTA 5 and that's way old. The 4080 is definitely the better way to go. Now, if you're talking about price, the MSRP for the 3080 Founders Edition is about $700 versus $1,200 for the 4080 Founders Edition. It's about a 71% increase in price. You don't quite get 71% performance increase. It is a big jump in performance, but it is a big jump in price. If you look at the prices of the cards going back to the GTX 980, which was released back in 2014, you'll see that they've been steady with price increases until you get to the 4080. The biggest jump in performance occurred between the 980 to the 1080 at 74% increase in performance and only a $50 increase in price. There could be several causes such as a chip shortage, inflation, greed. Regardless, it looks like that's how it's gonna be going forward with Nvidia. Now when it comes to gaming, out of the games that I played, it looked like Cyberpunk is where I saw the biggest difference between GTA 5 and Tomb Raider. You couldn't really see as big of a difference, at least with the naked eye, because my monitor is 144 hertz, so after 144 frames per second, you can't see the difference whether you're getting 200 frames per second versus 144 frames per second. Games that have a lot of ray tracing, the 4080 is definitely the way to go. As far as benchmarks go, the 4080 will blow the 3080 out of the water. On paper, it's very impressive. I was also surprised by the heat. It didn't run as hot as the 3080. That could be because of its massive size. It has a huge heatsink, huge fans. It's a triple slot GPU versus a dual slot GPU. So there's a lot more real estate when it comes to the size of the heatsink to cool off the GPU. Downside is if you have a mini ITX case, it more than likely will not fit in those cases. Even if if it did fit, I don't recommend you putting such a high powered GPU in those smaller cases. Now, is it worth the upgrade to a 3080 and a 4080? If you're wanting to start playing games in 4K, you may want to upgrade to 4080. I haven't run any tests, so I couldn't tell you what you should expect. That would be one reason why you would upgrade. The other is you don't know what to do with all the money you make, so you just want to upgrade just for craps and giggles. And if you really care about ray tracing, the 4080 will definitely give you better FPS when ray tracing is on. All right, well, that's about everything. I honestly can't think right now. I ran so many tests. Now that I have a 4080, I am gonna be running more tests. I'm gonna be trying different configurations. Maybe I'll pair the 4080 with the Celeron. It'll be kind of stupid. I'll figure it out. Anyways, it looks like my job's done here. All right, my brain is fried. Oh my gosh.